Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pints with Ayre. I'm Brent Heffley. I'm Sales and Marketing Director for Ayre Acoustics. I'm here with Ariel Brown, our Senior Engineer and VP, and Ryan Berry, our CEO and Expert Technician. Welcome, everyone. Hope you have your pint with you. I've got mine. You guys have yours. I was inspired by your last week's pick of an Oktoberfest.
Nice.
And I went out and I was able to find this great Ayre. Yeah, Martzen. So
That's a good one.
It's a
fancy
great
bottle too.
Yeah, very authentic. I did a little quick research and I knew the Martzen style, but I was like, Oktoberfest Martzen, and it turns out that that's actually the original Oktoberfest beer style. The Helles wasn't actually introduced until 1953 as a prime Oktoberfest beer. So this was a style they'd brew in March, store it in cold storage caves or whatever through the summer and into the fall, and then break it out for Oktoberfest. So
cool.
Yeah, cool little tad bit of history.
There's passion in brewing there.
Yeah, for sure.
Can always appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. What did you guys break out today?
We've got a German style wheat ale, Prost Brewing up in Fort Collins, relatively local again.
Nice. Nice.
Says, drink like a German on the side.
Prost. Right, Prost.
Prost.
Excellent. I love Oktoberfest time.
That's tasty.
Great stuff. Okay, so today our audio topic, we're going to talk about something not so much on the inside of the products, but on the outside, and that's I guess it's the bridge, right? It's the display. And, not every audio product has a display. Our displays vary from a single LED, as an on or standby indicator, all the way up to a full-fledged, streaming data information displays and everywhere in between. But we go through a long process in looking for our displays, finding the right display, because there can be some issues, and the primary one's noise.
Yeah, because if you're actually trying to display any verbose information, the most traditional method is going to be some kind of display that is active, that's multiplexing or some form where it's actually constantly updating, and so it has a lot of voltages switching. And when you have that, you are going to be generating and radiating noise within your chassis.
And so the display is one of those places where you want to have as good of an interface as possible with the product, but it doesn't really do anything good for the sound in the sense of a good display doesn't make it sound better. It just makes it sound less worse. And so it's one of those technologies that it takes a surprising amount of time to get the right thing into place, and can sometimes be surprisingly expensive. But without doing those things, without the shielding and all the tricks that are part of the trade to keep that noise from getting into the circuit, it can have a definite detrimental effect to the sound.
For sure. And there's an argument definitely to be had for not having any display at all.
Yep.
But it's a limitation, right? Because then you can't see what volume level you're at from your seating position, or what track you're on, or
led to a few debates here and there too, I remember.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If it's too loud, turn it down. If it's too quiet, turn it up. We don't need to see what the number is.
For sure. So we actually use different displays in each series of product that we have, and that's alludes to what you said earlier, Ryan, because some of them can cost quite a lot.
Yep.
On the top end with the R series, we use a special Noritake display from Japan.
Yeah, that's in the KXR specifically.
Right. So there's a reason that we chose that. Ariel, what's the technology behind that
Yeah, so to back up a little bit, for that product, we wanted, relatively graphic display that we could display a lot of characters and actually display very useful information, have customizable names and show the volume in large fonts. So we wanted something graphic, but we also wanted something that did not generate any noise. So we found this is actually a VFD, which are known for being fairly bright. Which is, they're most often used for like a lot of outdoor settings. But so this particular display it's what's called static. It's a static VFD, and so it works. There's basically little semiconductor chips with phosphor on top of the chip, and so you send a bunch of data to it serially, very briefly, and then it latches it and it holds each of those bits, each of those little pixels individually is stored. And so they're not constantly updated. They're actually, they're updated once and then they keep their state. So that, it's only generating noise briefly as you change the display, but then it shuts it off entirely and keeps all of its pixel states. And it generates no more noise. There's no clocks running, nothing. And that ties in a lot with our, with our control technology. Just a quick aside, whenever we switch to microcontroller control, we only did that once we were confident we could put the microcontroller to sleep, and that's for the exact same reason. So the KXR is the same story. When the microprocessor wakes up, it needs to change an input or change the volume or handle some kind of input. It wakes up briefly, changes the display goes to sleep, except that the phosphors, the pixels stay on, and then the microprocessor goes to sleep.
That's actually a pretty important distinction, like when he talks about the latching, what a normal display is doing is it's kind of like a TV screen where it's scanning constantly, over and over and over and over again. And it never stops as long as that display is there. Even if nothing is changing, it's still updating every one of those pixels to say, okay, am I supposed to be on or off? And it scans through that, and that all generates noise. And even when you do your best to shield a lot of that, there's still an effect on that noise being generated on your data lines, which kind of gets back into the circuit too. So it's a real big problem to have to deal with, and it's not easy. And so this particular display was a genius find for us, and does what Ariel says, where it just locks it down. It doesn't generate that noise while it's sitting there static. And there was only one machine in the world that was making it for Noritake, and unfortunately that machine has since been retired because there wasn't many companies that wanted to spend as much as we were spending on each display, which they were in the hundreds of dollars for each one of those displays.
Yeah, I know they were super expensive.
Yeah, very expensive, and nobody else would really saw the benefit of those things. So once the machine decided to get to the final legs of its journey, then they came to us one last time and said it's not feasible for us to repair the machine. Tell us how many more you want, and that's going to be the last we're going to have to do of these. So
wow,
that was we had to get that lifetime buy, so to speak, and call it a day on them.
Yeah, I remember there being a pretty cool story about when we decided to use that, and the guys from Noritake USA coming to visit Ayre.
Well, actually, Noritake, Japan also, and so the guy, one of the guy that actually invented that technology, he was in the country, it was in the state, and he came and visited us, and he was absolutely thrilled that we wanted to use his technology, because it wasn't, it was so expensive that it was prohibitive for a lot of industries, and so they'd seen disappointing demand for it.
Right, and we were the ones who actually got what he was trying to do, and we're super excited about it. And I, from the version I heard, that he was moved to tears because we were so like into what he did and really totally understood it and were thrilled about it. So it's a pretty special moment. It's so cool that he was actually in the States at that particular time, and they came out to Ayre. So very, very fun.
Absolutely.
But of course, we can't use that in every product, right? That's R
Right.
series level expense, kind of like the
Unfortunately,
circuit boards we use in there, and a lot of the other parts.
kind of goes back to that conversation we had last video where last week where we're talking about if we could we'd put every toy and bell and whistle into each product, but
Yep.
yeah, it's one of those that's a great example of one of those lines you just have to draw.
Yeah. So how do we, when we go down to the 5 series, right? We have a segmented display. How do we mitigate noise with that? Because it still shows a lot of useful information. It's still bright. It still, gets you what you need to know. But obviously, it's not, the hundreds and hundreds of dollars that the Noritake are.
Right. Yeah. So we use character segment LED displays there, and so either a 7 segment or a 14 segment, depending on whether we're just numbers or if we need to do a full character set. And so and especially because we a long time determined that we really preferred blue, and so that blue LEDs, and so that complicated most just in terms of cost a bit, because the blue is about 5 to 10 times the cost of a red or green LED. But so we have to look for and find character displays that have individual drive for each of these segments. There are plenty out there that again, like, require you to basically multiplex, to basically scan through.
Right, because of the
and so that's easier for just for a 7 segment display. We're talking about 14 segment display, and actually getting in a reasonable size. It creates physical constraints as far as like getting that many pins out so that you can solder to a board. And so there's some creative there are some creative component packaging for some of those parts. So again, we basically, and we did this even before we found the Noritake display, but we do a very similar thing where we have basically a CFO buffers, a serial in, parallel out. So we send a string of data, and then latches then latch in that data and drive each segment individually, so we can have however many we need. We just daisy chain them. And so, and again, it's just 100% on or off.
And an LED on its own is generally a low noise device. We use them for various things.
By itself, yes.
So it's just the multiplexing and the scanning and whatnot with the driver chips that is where your noise is. So
if we can avoid that, then we're making a pretty quiet display overall.
Right. So your biggest limitation with a display like that is just what you can display, because
you can't do graphics.
There's only so much that you can do with LEDs. I mean, you could make a dot matrix display supposedly with enough LEDs, but
yeah, and there are companies that have done that.
But it takes up real estate to do that, and you only get so much resolution. Even then, you're not going to display album art cover, or album cover art, for example, with a grid of LEDs, but you could display various characters.
Right. Yeah, the other benefit of doing static drive is that you actually have it's actually easier to get reasonable brightness, because when you are multiplexing, you are basically pulsing on and off, and so that actually lowers your average brightness. And so our method is actually really easy to get too bright. And so we have to do very, very, very careful current control for each segment, just to get the desired brightness.
Right, right. So we've got segmented LEDs. We're sending them the signal. They're on all the time, and then we're not continually sending them signal. It's only when something changes that we turn on the microprocessor.
Yeah, which only takes a couple milliseconds.
Right.
And then it's done.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of similar to what we do where we in other products where we turn off sections of them if they're not being used. The separate clocks in the DACs, for example.
Oh yeah, I mean that's a whole other rabbit hole to go down.
Right.
If you talk about all the processors and things we turn off when they're not being used, yeah, that's a whole conversation.
We'll do that rabbit hole in another video.
Absolutely. Yep.
So great, and then on most of the amplifiers, we just have a single LED that's either an on or goes to standby.
Yeah. So far, yeah, all the amplifiers we've ever done, they're really not a you know a real need to have any verbose information, and so just a single color LED is enough to give the important information.
Right, right. Especially with AirLink because you can hook them together, and if there's
Yeah.
anything that the amplifier needs to display, it will actually send the signal to the preamp, and you can see
Right.
a message displayed there.
Correct.
Yeah, and the amps actually use tricolor in most cases for us.
Yep.
So and that's advantageous because we can light up various combinations, and that gets you a whole spectrum of different colors that you can use for indicating status.
Right.
Which
Right.
is good for I don't know, forget what the percentage is, but there are a few people out there who are colorblind, and so we've had a few times where
Yep.
we've had some mistranslation of what the
Well,
color is.
that's where, like you said, AirLink comes into real play, because now when you have the AirLink connected to a KXR, for example, the KXR will display exactly what the MXR is seeing, and will give you all that information, and it's easy to read on that display and holds it for you to kind of be able to report back, and it makes it a lot easier to figure out what's going on.
Right. Now, as we've gotten into streaming and a lot more album information and things like that, being needing to display that, the 8 series has its own display since that's
Well, I think before we go to the 8 series, we should talk about the 5 series, because that was the first foray into that, and we had to
true.
we had to really set up and kind of think, how are we going to make these LEDs work? And that was quite the adventure too, because that particular, the QX5, we did a lot of the similar technology where we had LED, 14 digit or 14 segment LEDs, but we had to use a whole bunch of them, and of course these aren't lined up at all. So we found when we first started running these things, we had a big long segment of these LEDs, and by the time that the board house would get done, they would kind of wave across the whole thing. So we had to figure out better ways to keep them lined up and perfectly straight with one another, and the board house actually had to kind of think outside the box to get that to work, because it was definitely a challenge that we didn't kind of foresee when we started the process, because we're like, oh, just add more segments.
Yeah.
But then once it came out in practice, it's like, oh, this is not going to work unless we think of something new.
Right. No, that's interesting. I mean, that kind of, it typifies some of those things where when you're building a new piece yourself, there's things you don't anticipate and you have to figure out.
All of a sudden you have 100 boards and you're like, oh, well, we got to fix all of these. Yep.
Yeah.
So then, the 8 series was after that, and after the experiences with the QX5, which, we had the system down at that point in time, so we could have done something like that in the 8 series, but there's also been a lot of demand of having more information, and people always want to see a little bit more, so they like to see the artist and the album and the all the metadata that comes with it, and we wouldn't be able to emulate that with segments of LEDs unless we made the thing 12 inches tall, and we have row after row after row of LEDs. It just wasn't feasible.
Yeah.
So that's where we had to start thinking of new ways to do things. Obviously, we couldn't fit the same display that we use in the KXR into the budget,
right?
Or a bigger one actually is what it would require. We couldn't do segmented LEDs to get the information that people were really wanting in the market. So we had to look into other ways to do things that would both get that information across to the user, as well as have a way of making it so it doesn't just completely trash the sound of the player itself. So that was the next series of technology.
Yeah, and we had a little bit of experience with that with the DX5, where we had to deal with the Oppo display to go with the drive.
Yep. Yeah, most commercial grade products, they don't consider these factors like, companies like us do. And so, when you're talking the C5 or the DX5, these began their lives as off-the-shelf players by other companies. And we strip them down, of course. We take as much out of it as we can and replace it with our own technology. Power supply, clocks, audio, obviously. Change all the switching components, switching power supply components to linear, create our own linear power supply into the unit, and then, but there's still some things that we use from the old technology, and the display is one of those things.
Right.
And now it's, like you said, it's working with something that's effectively inferior technology and trying to make it good.
Sure. Sure. With the 8 series, we display a lot more information, and
Yep.
it comes with a little bit of a cost in
Yeah.
noise, right? Like
Yeah.
there's only so much we can do, but we do some things to help mitigate that.
So it's an OLED display, and it does generate noise because it does do the refresh, and there's no getting around that. There's no methodology that defeats the cost of an OLED screen. So we've listened to it. We did A to B tests. We've heard it with the display on. We've heard it with the display off, and it does make an effect. It does carry a negative effect when that display is running. So we kind of scratched our heads, and there's not a way to change it, and there wasn't any other technology available that fixes the problem. So what we did was effectively a compromise, and that is with an EX8 or a QX8 or any of the other 8 series, we run the display when anything changes. So it will come up, during the beginning of a new song, or if the volume's changed or whatnot, to indicate that something has happened, that the unit's received the information. But then after a few seconds, we turn the display back off to ensure that it sounds as good as possible for the majority of the time you're listening to it.
Right, and you can select how long that timeout is in the menu, which is pretty cool because
Yep.
you may not want it to hardly come on at all because you're there with your app and you're just looking at the data that way, which is what I usually do. I'm if I want to see the how much time's left or the album art, I'm not trying to look at the display on the machine.
Right.
It's 10, 12 feet away. I just use my phone or tablet.
And that's kind of an interesting thing with the EX8 and the QX8, and even the QX5 is with, as streaming becomes more and more of a thing, the phones have become better and better at being the quote unquote remote control for the player, and that really opens up a lot of possibilities for you, because now the thing that's generating the noise is in your hands. It's not in the system that you're working with anymore. It's removed.
Right.
And you can get a lot more information, and you can change it on the fly through app development and stuff and things like that. So, if you decide you want to add this piece of information and it's available in the metadata, you just add it in the code and you're done. And so, whereas physical display is very static, and once it's designed, it's designed. So there's not a lot of things you can always do to a display that once it exists.
Sure. Sure, you're limited by what's in there and what's driving.
Yeah, like we could never add artist information to a QX5, for example.
Yeah.
But it's easy to put it into Bubble UPnP, for example, if you're running your QX5 off that, or MConnect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a good point, because we're still, we're not really at the infancy of streaming, but it's still growing. It's still changing a lot, and we've got
Quite a bit
ways to go.
Oh yeah.
Still, so we'll see a lot of changes, and being able to adapt with that via a phone, via that type of display is really a more desirable way to go, at least in my opinion, because you've got what you want in your hands. You can even go through and read more about the album, read more about the artist, things that just is not feasible at all in terms of a display on a piece of equipment.
Yep.
So, yeah, great. Do you guys foresee, I mean, there's different products that we've done that barely have a display at all, like a phono stage, for example. We could, in future products, things, do you see any new technologies that we might use or look at, things we haven't been able to do so far that would be interesting in a display sense out there? I know it's a pretty broad question, but
Yeah, I mean, we've got a good toolkit, I think, right now, and there's certainly costs to running an OLED, for example, and there's costs to running an LED, and we kind of understand that gradient at this point in time. We know that color, for example, in a display is much more problematic than running monochromatic, but there might be a demand for that where it's justified.
right.
But we would still treat it in ways that we do, to try to minimize the impact that it has. But as far as anything new technologies, we're kind of on the cusp of the technology right now. OLED's kind of the big thing in the industry at the moment,
Sure.
And you know, the technologies that were the best, frankly, like the Noritake display that we were using, is more or less the bygones of an older era, and don't really exist anymore. So, you know, we'll definitely always assess anything if it doesn't need a crazy amount of information, like a phono preamplifier, for example, is not going to need a lot of information being conveyed to you at any point in time. It preamplifies phono signal, and you get sound.
Yeah, but it's usually a one-time setup for phonos, such as typically.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it has mechanical knobs or switches and potentially.
Precisely. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we have all kinds of, you know, means at our disposal at this point in time with the experience we have as a company. So you know, we just determine it case by case is what it comes down to, and if it doesn't need all the information, we would either do no display or the LED segments, because we know that those are the quietest and they're the most pure. If it needs a lot of information, that's something that the market would really demand. You know, we know how to make an OLED sound pretty decent. You know, we do some various things to it in addition to just shutting it off to try to keep things as minimized as possible. And you know, we kind of just treat it as we go.
Right.
Everything's an organic process.
Yeah, and also like looking, you know, quite a bit forward. You know, like kind of like you mentioned, is that you know, removing the display from the product and moving it to your hand, and moving the whole control interface to your pocket, more or less.
Right.
May actually be the best solution there.
Yeah.
You know, looking quite a ways ahead.
Yeah.
Because that's really is where it's headed.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Arm's length ahead until you get to the look at it close again.
Yeah, I mean, we're not looking to do that right away for sure, you know, but it's definitely something that we keep an eye on, and if if it ever gets to that point where everybody wants that, then you know, we'll look into it. I'm always skeptical about not having some kind of a front display on a unit, but you know, that's the debate that we get to have in the development phase, and that's one of the fun things we get to do. It's always the whole, you know, how many engineers does it take to design a paperclip kind of question, but at the end of the day, it's also the fun part of the process, is making something new.
For sure. It is a good part. So, all right. Well, that's the lowdown on displays. If you have any questions, email us, pints@ayre.com. If you have any good Oktoberfest Martzen suggestions, we'll take those too.
Yes, please. We need enough to last through the next 2 weeks.
Right. I think we're going to squeeze a lot of episodes in the next 2 weeks just so we can take advantage of Oktoberfest.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thanks for watching. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers.